All right. I think uh, I think we're live. Just gonna wait for some people to trickle in. See if the notifications are getting any more reliable. I doubt it, but you never know. I actually saw something recently with Susan Wojcicki. I think they're fine tuning their censorship, uh, especially now that Elon. Hey, GW. Especially now that Elon is the tentative owner of Twitter and is, if you believe reports, is going to fire all of the lavishly paid censorship gurus from the Indian subcontinent that have been that have been in control of Twitter ever since Jack Dorsey took a leave of absence. So I think there is going to be a doubling down in terms of trying to control the narrative, trying to censor voices, restrict voices, and going to become more and more hysterical as the elections near. Just as the same thing happened after 2016, and then it ramped up all the way into basically the election when the Hunter Biden story was effectively squelched. It was removed from any sort of social media just because the people in charge of these companies wanted to ensure Joe Biden's election. Yeah, I didn't even think about it, but that's actually a very good point. The outward migration we see of liberals to conservative states, and you see this all over the place. This is one of the reasons that states like Vermont and to a lesser degree New Hampshire became very blue in the Northeast. It's also had an impact in some southern states like North Carolina. Georgia is a big one. A lot of these suburban counties that were reliably Republican and that were bastions of conservatism, a lot of them have, if not flipped, the voting, the electoral power has been diluted by the migration of liberals southward. So you have a lot of ex-New Yorkers, what they call snowbirds, who've basically transformed large sections of the South. It's happened to a certain extent in Texas, in states like Montana, particularly around these very desirable resort towns or what have become resort towns. They were they weren't resort towns until people like Tom Brokaw moved there, but uh, a lot of the college towns, they've sort of had this outsized influence over the voting patterns, and you see this in California, which used to be a purplish state. It would vote, especially in landslide years, it would vote reliably for the Republican candidate if you had a good, or not good, but popular candidate representing the Republican Party, like Ronald Reagan or Richard Nixon. And it used to be a purplish bellwether type state. And the same was true. The same was true of some states like Colorado, and they've been transformed entirely by, well, in the case of California, immigration, but also in some of these other states, it's just Americans migrating to a low tax, relatively low regulation, warmer or more hospitable climate, and it's been a disaster. The road decision, if it's actually enacted in several of these states like Florida, Texas, some of these states with electoral potency, it might actually solidify them politically. I never thought of that that aspect, but it's definitely something to consider. Um, well, there are a lot of dimensions to this. One of the aspects I wanted to talk about was who was responsible for disclosing this draft opinion, and there's been all sorts of speculation. The main the running theory is that it was leaked by the staffer for a liberal justice. A lot of people have written about a clerk for Sonia Sotomayor, who, if we lived in a meritocracy, probably would not be a member of the Supreme Court. She was sort of the template for Ketanji Jackson Brown, in the sense of being selected purely because she fits certain demographic. Uh, she fits certain desirable demographics electorally. So Joe Biden made a promise, not just that he would look for, not just one of these generic promises to be more inclusive or diverse in his judicial selection process, but basically he made a promise to appoint a specific race and a specific gender to the court. In this case, an African American woman, and he was sort of bound by that. So there's 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 this weird argument by progressives that pointing this out is racist. The idea that if you if you simply if you simply state the truth that this woman, yes, she was a judge, she was a federal judge, she theoretically met the minimum qualifications to be appointed to the Supreme Court. You don't actually have to be a sitting judge, but she was a very recently appointed federal judge. But her main qualifications were that she allowed Joe Biden to keep his campaign promise that he would appoint an African American woman. But Sonia Sotomayor was sort of the template for that, because she was the first Latina, or Latinx, uh, as they say, Supreme Court justice. If you don't consider Louis Brandeis, if you don't want to include him, hey, Tower Time, then she would have been the first Hispanic justice, and she was incredibly not qualified. I mean, beyond the fact that she was a judge, there wasn't really anything to merit her selection. So a lot of people think that Sotomayor, one of her clerks, leaked this information, and on the surface, it makes a lot of sense. That if you think about it from a purely political perspective, and that would be the only reason to disclose this information, it's very helpful to gin up hysteria, especially if you have a president at the top of your ticket who's the standard bearer for your party, and who's going to be in all sorts of opposition advertising going into November. uh I don't think they would face charges. I'm I'm not sure. There's a Department of Justice investigation looking into this, but I don't think they actually committed a crime. I could be wrong about this. Latinx. Well, they're trying to move to Latine, or Latin, Latine, which is kind of funny when you think about it. You create this wholly synthetic term that has no roots in the Spanish language. And then when people who are Spanish speaking, who are Hispanic, uh, uh, decry this sort of this sort of cultural imperialism, this liberal cultural imperialism, then you invent another term that falls into the same trap. You're basically doing the same thing, ignoring what they, ignoring the people that are complaining about it. Yeah, Latin is either, but but I don't think it's a crime. I was reading some things about it. I don't think it was a crime, and even if it was a crime, I'm very dubious that the person who committed it would be prosecuted. I mean, just look at Hillary Clinton, who's committed multiple felonies over the course of her career. Most recently, and the most notorious is probably what she did with regard to the Steele dossier. Her her involvement in Russiagate was definitely a crime, or multiple crimes, really. And yet she's been able to get off scot free. I know the Durham investigation. Um, they've been making some threatening statements, or there've been rumors that something's going to occur there, but I highly doubt that's the case. But even in similar cases like this, like the FBI, the liberal FBI agent who leaked was, I think, given a year probation. They were basically given a pat on the back and then universally celebrated among the leftist intelligentsia, or what passes for it. So I seriously doubt. I don't think it was a crime, at least what I've said. And again, I'm by no means an expert in this, but I don't think it was a crime. And even if it was a crime, I highly doubt that the person would be prosecuted. I mean, the Democratic Party is united. As far as I can see, I haven't seen a single politically significant Democratic figure, an office holder, decry this leak. So I doubt they're going to be prosecuted. But the idea that it was a clerk for one of the liberal justices like Sotomayor, has a lot of resonance. Because again, you have this party that ran solely on a platform of removing Donald Trump, with the underlying premise there, at least for people who are not complete NPCs, and suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. The premise there was that it would be an improvement, whatever horrible things this malefactor Donald Trump did while in office, that the person who replaced him would be an improvement upon Donald Trump, which is sort of ridiculous when you look at the fact that the person that they had to replace him is this senescent, completely out of it, basically a meat puppet they put up in order to have someone on the ballot. So the premise itself was bizarre, but that was the implication, that this would be better. It's not gotten better. It's gotten it's gotten much, much worse. They're presiding over this dumpster fire. Stagflation has returned for the first time in force since the Carter presidency. One foreign policy disaster after another. A border crisis that didn't exist when he was inaugurated has mushroomed, and you have 1 million illegal aliens coming across the border, and a situation that's going to be exacerbated when newly minted refugees start pouring across the border because of the COVID restrictions that are about to be lifted. So you have this disaster, and one of the ways to distract from this, for a while they were using the Ukraine conflict trying to get a rally around the flag effect going. Of course, not rally around the United States flag, but the Ukrainian flag, and it was a disaster. It's like all of these other things they've tried to introduce. The Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife, that the manufactured hysteria around her, trying to re trying to rekindle a hysteria around COVID, all sorts of plans to distract from the abject failure of the person they installed in office. Those have all floundered. So now you have an attempt uh, to gin up the hardcore pro-abortion, pro-infanticide feminist base of the Democratic Party and capitalize upon this decades-long, what amounted to a fundraising appeal that the Republicans are going to overturn Roe v. Wade. So if this is true, if this draft opinion reflects the majority sentiment on the court, then they can finally there'll finally be some legitimacy to their claim that the Republicans are going to take away Roe, and ergo, we need to retain Congress. Whereas for the previous year, there's been no incentive for anyone who's not brainwashed to want to to want to keep the Democratic Party in power. Now you have an issue that might energize their base, or one of their main bases of support, which is abortion. And supporting abortion is the sine qua non for a Democratic Party politician. And a good illustration of this is Dennis Kucinich and Marcy Kaptur. Now, these were two what you would call yellow dog Democrats who were in Congress for decades. They represented Kucinich represented Cleveland, and Kaptur, I believe, Akron, or another Rust Belt city in Ohio. And for years, they were on the very progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They were at the far end, at kind of the cutting edge of the left wing of the Democratic Party. But one of the exceptions was the abortion issue. They were both pro-life and they were anti-abortion. But once they started to ascend the ranks of the Democratic Party, for Kucinich, it was a run for president, and I think for Kaptur, she became the chairman of a committee within the House of Representatives. Once they start to do that, they switched on a dime. They abandoned all of their previous convictions regarding the life issue, and they affirmed a woman's right, quote unquote, to terminate her pregnancy, to kill her child in utero. And you've seen this throughout. Another good example is Bob Casey, the senator from Pennsylvania, who was the son of a staunchly pro-life, blue-collar Roman Catholic politician named Robert Casey Sr., who was the governor of Pennsylvania. And he was actually denied a speaking slot at the 1992 Democratic National Convention because of his stance on the abortion issue. He was pro-life, and therefore he was not allowed to speak. That's a good question. Do leftist politicians have convictions? I don't think so, for the most part. I mean, it's very rare. I think the left in general wants to wield power, and they simply view some of these things as an expedient to that end. And another great example of this is the issue of so-called gay marriage. If you go back and you look at most Democrats throughout the 90s, as the gay rights movement gained steam and started accumulating cultural or judicial victories, the Democratic Party started become more and more favorable towards gay rights, and Bill Clinton was sort of at the forefront of this. But at this simultaneously, the Democrats also never they always maintained that gay marriage was a non-starter, and this was true all the way up through Barack Obama, his election as president, and even right before the Obergefell Supreme Court decision, he said that he did not believe in gay marriage, and his stance started to temporize a bit on that issue as the activists became more insistent on this being a part of the Democratic Party platform, but he still did not fully embrace the concept of gay marriage until Obergefell, until the Supreme Court forced his hand. And it's interesting, when Hillary Clinton was pressed on this issue by Terry Gross, she had a conniption fit. And it was very amusing because Terry Gross is the archetypal liberal NPR anchor or NPR host, this sort of Northeast progressive bug woman who, I mean, she's a good interviewer. She's a decent interviewer. She has a lot of talent, but she has the standard issue beliefs of any NPC that you would have a conversation with in a city like New York or Los Angeles. She basically, down the line, but she, like I said, she's a good interviewer, and sometimes her journalistic zeal crops up. And in this particular instance, she asked a very benign question of Hillary Clinton. She asked her, "How do you reconcile?" I'm paraphrasing here, but she basically pointed out the fact that Hillary Clinton, up until recently, i.e., after the Supreme Court decision, had opposed gay marriage, and during even during her campaign against Barack Obama, I believe she had the same stance. So in this interview, she asked her this very benign question and this very obvious question that anyone would ask. You had this very strong conviction that homosexuals should not be that the state should not recognize homosexual unions in the form of a marriage license. They shouldn't be able to be married even if they had they were entitled to the same benefits as a result of a civil union. And then you abandon this entirely. What's what gives? Why did you do that? It's a very simple question that anyone with an ounce of integrity and mental consistency would ask. Hi, Richard. And yet she had a complete meltdown. The circuitry of her brain melted down, and she just started. She basically accused Terry Gross and the people who would ask this of being liars, or somehow she didn't use those exact words, but she basically implied that this was some sort of to use her phrase, vast right-wing conspiracy, and that she had not opposed gay marriage all of those years prior, and that she wasn't the wife of a man who signed the Defense of Marriage Act into law. So that little exchange is an example of when you said, do leftists have political conviction? That's an example of it's an illustration of how they don't, for the most part, leftist politicians. Now, of course, there are progressives that have very strong political convictions. Jimmy Dore is one example, or Glenn Greenwald, the writer for The Guardian. There are a lot of non-politician examples of progressives that have strong convictions, but in terms of politics, the overriding kind of the basis for progressive politics is attaining wielding and retaining power, which is why things like gay marriage, they basically they abandon their convictions when they're not convenient to the ends. So the means are simply a way of arriving at the ends in their minds. And I think that's the dominant that's the dominant framework in politics in general, but I think particularly it's really stunning to look at it from the leftist side. And I think a great and this example is more theoretical, but a good illustration of this would be immigration. If most of the immigrants coming to this country post 1965, after the Hart-Celler Act, if they were conservative, if they were economic conservatives who supported the Republican Party, the Democratic Party would be much more inclined to restrict immigration. They would kind of be like what Cesar Chavez was back in the 60s as head of the United Fruit Workers. You know, they'd call illegal aliens scabs and want to throw them out of the country. For Senate votes. That's a good one. So yeah, it's a very and a lot of times it's a political expedient. It's these positions are simply means to obtain power. But the idea that this was leaked by a clerk, I think it has a lot of merit to it. But one of the things, but because of that reason, the idea of distracting the public, of trying to galvanize support for a party which is imploding as we speak. But I think an even better theory, and it's ironic because the person who posited this is generally a complete clown. Charles Pierce, the writer for Esquire, who's one of these people. He's a person whose mind has been rotted from the inside through Trump derangement syndrome. He's not simply a critic of Donald Trump, but he's become so obsessed with him he's become so obsessed with the persona of Donald Trump that everything he writes is filtered through the prism of this irrational hatred of Donald Trump. But he wrote a good, not a good, but he wrote an interesting piece for Esquire where he implied that, heavily implied that Chief Justice John Roberts was the one who would disclose this. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. When you analyze it, when you look at this analytically, what would be the purpose of leaking this? So in the draft opinion, we know that John Roberts was not a party to this. And again, this is just an opinion. The Supreme Court confirmed its authenticity, so we know that this is an actual opinion. They said that it did not necessarily reflect a decision. So we don't know if this is going to be the decision that's ultimately handed down, but we know that it's authentic. And what would be the reason for disclosing this? Again, ginning up hysteria among people who are inclined to vote for the Democratic Party. That's sort of Occam's razor in this case. That's the easiest and most likely scenario, the easiest scenario to justify. And it makes a lot of sense, and it might be factual. That might be the case. But what's another plausible theory? And I think this has a lot of merit. The idea that John Roberts, this is a draft opinion. We know that John Roberts was not a party to the majority opinion. It was authored by Samuel Alito. So if John Roberts had concurred with this opinion, we would have known it if he had authored. That's the thing. If this opinion, um, if there's an actual decision that reverses Roe versus Wade and reverses Pennsylvania, reverses Casey, Roe and Casey. If there's an opinion that reverses that, and it's 6-3, John Roberts would be the author of that majority opinion. He would not. First of all, I don't think he would reverse Roe. I don't think there's anything in his record to indicate that he would be willing to do that. But second of all, if he did, he would be the author of that. That's true. I am too broke. Well, that's the thing. You. That's how you become rich. You become a politician. I mean, look at AOC. She was a cocktail waitress or a very inept bartender before, and now she's in the 1%. But if there was a decision to reverse Roe, he would be in the majority of the opinion. He wouldn't assign this opinion to Samuel Alito, whom he probably despises, because Samuel Alito actually is ethically consistent. He has a moral framework. He's not a careerist, and he's not one of these I mean, John Roberts is the epitome of opportunism and careerism. He spent his entire adult life up until I think he was 40 or 42, I forget, but he was in his early 40s when he was confirmed to the Supreme Court as the Chief Justice. He spent his entire career inching towards that goal, which is why you never find him. He was thought of as a stealth conservative. It turns out he was a stealth opportunist. He was a liberal. But he spent his entire career up to that point trying to avoid any sort of controversial paper trail that would sink his chances at being on the Supreme Court. Because if he was a genuinely conservative, originalist jurist like Alito, he would have had difficulty being confirmed. And I think the vote to confirm Roberts, I don't think, I'm not sure if it was unanimous, but it was nearly unanimous. So just think of that. You have a Senate that has people like Charles Schumer and James Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, in the same body, and they both agree that this person should have lifetime tenure on the most important decision-making body right now in the United States. Yeah, he has a job for life, but my point was he had that position before. I mean, that's how he got there in the first place. So being Chief Justice was the apotheosis of his life, and he wants to retain that job and to be in that position in perpetuity. He does not want to relinquish any power or perquisites that attain to that office. So if there was going to be this monumental decision reversing Roe, which he would never do because he would never want to be vilified by the Washington elite, the establishment. He wants to be in their good graces, which ironically, he's kind of in the position now of being hated by both sides, by most people, maybe with a few exceptions. But he would want to be the author of that. So the fact that Alito is the author tells you that he is not a party to this decision, most likely. So he sees his work at creating this centrist, corporatist body that doesn't make any waves by clawing back all of the victories the left has won in our culture, and the erosion of our constitutional liberties. He doesn't want to do any of that. He just wants to have this little signature where he can wield power. And he sees this being eroded by Trump nominees who, although they're not perfect by any stretch, and there could have been much better nominees for the most part, they still are pushing back or resisting that temptation to simply uh, serve as John Roberts's courtiers. To they're pushing back, and he's seeing the goal he had his entire life, being chief, namely being Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He's seeing that disintegrate before his eyes. So yes, he's the Chief Justice, but he's essentially the Chief Justice of a rump minority of hapless liberals like Elena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor and um, soon to be Ketanji Brown Jackson. So that's not what he wanted to do. He did not want to be the John Paul Stevens or the David Souter, the Stephen Breyer of the Supreme Court. He wanted to be the William Rehnquist or the Justice Berger, if you will. And that's something that's a dream that's just being erased. If being erased by Donald Trump, someone he probably despises. So, in that sense, I think leaking from and his reaction is a bit of a tell. The sulfuric reaction he had to this leak, which again, it destroys precedent, it undermines trust in the Supreme Court, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. But his reaction is sort of his volcanic reaction. It's a tell. It's sort of like it's sort of like O.J. Simpson. It's sort of like O.J. Simpson's reaction, even after his trial, after he was acquitted in the criminal trial of the which accused him of murdering his wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman. So even after that, he continues to maintain that he's innocent and that, he needs to find the real killers. So someone who is guilty will have this sort of reaction instead of simply having a press release saying this is wrong, whoever did this violated our confidence. Instead of releasing a sedate press release and or denouncing it via the media, he demands there be a Justice Department investigation, even though, as I said, I'm not sure that it's even illegal. There should be a Justice Department investigation. We need to find when he probably actually knows who's responsible for this. And Charles Pierce, like I said, the guy's a bozo, but he made a salient point here. Charles Pierce, in his piece, he said, yeah, he already knows who's responsible for this, John Roberts. Yeah, he responded to the leak. He's responded. As far as I know, he's the only justice who's responded. I could be mistaken. Maybe there are others, but he's had the most vehement and the most disproportionate response, which leads me to believe that there's some element of guilt there. It's kind of like revealing your hand. So I think overall, that when you look at it, when you do forensic examination of who's the guilty party, I think a lot of signs point to John Roberts. Again, it could be Occam's razor, just a liberal clerk for Sotomayor, or one of these, or Kagan, just spilled the beans. I mean, they have activists. That's one of the main avenues for judicial activism, is clerkships for the Supreme Court, and clerkships for the Supreme Court are often an avenue to federal judgeships. So it's a very profitable. It's much more prestigious than working as an intern for, say, Amy Klobuchar or one of these insane Democratic senators. Uh, so yeah, I think it again. I could be wrong. I've been wrong many times before, but it probably is Roberts. Which, if it is, we yeah, most likely won't discover it. It'll be the equivalent of OJ's search to find the real killers, and we will never discover who they are. Anyway, I ran pretty long here, but I just thought I'd post my thoughts on that. And here quietly leaked this. Yeah, the fact that it was leaked to Politico instead of the Washington Post or the New York Times, that's also somewhat revealing. It's someone who is tuned into Washington D.C. politics. So for something that's a national story that should be national headlines, you figure you would leak it to one of the national newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, maybe the Wall Street Journal. Instead, you leak it to the DC Gazette, basically. You leak it to a website which is only known for being hypersensitive to very niche political developments within the Beltway. So, I mean, that's also a tell that it's probably Roberts. But anyway, ran long here, but I'm glad all of you came. Richard, Tower Time, Alejandro, GW, anyone else who was watching in the chat. Feel free to like, subscribe, and share for those of you who are visiting. Those of you who are regulars, you can share too, although I don't know how many people want to listen to a 42-minute long meandering talk about the minutia of the Supreme Court. Yeah, that's another possibility. KBG, the bad KBG, not KJ Kentaji. What is it? Not KJB, K Kentaji Brown Jackson. It's funny, the people who love her so much can't even pronounce her name correctly, which is sort of amusing. Anyway, I will see you all soon. Gonna try to continue that series on the Book of Mormon, hopefully sometime in the future. And that's all, folks.